Okay, this is our final segment for Monday, and we're talking Truman, the UN, and the Cold War. Roosevelt's dream of a world peace organization that would give self determination to the peoples of the world, which was the belief many people had at that point about what we could do to avoid another world war, would be to allow people to make their own decision as to what type of government that they have. Now, as I mentioned to you before, there's a sense that, and by the way, that comes from the something called the Atlantic Charter, which was an agreement signed by the Americans and the British prior to the American entry into World War II. And there were four freedoms that were put in there that Roosevelt said he was very much for, and they were basic ideas that it seemed that all the victorious nations of the war agreed upon. And so what we were talking about earlier was the American view that the Soviets began the Cold War, rather than allowing self-determination in the countries that it controlled following the war. The USSR had elections, and you can put those into quotations, put that term into quotations if you choose to. And it seemed that everywhere there were Soviet troops, that the people there would, quote, vote for a communist regime. The truth is the Soviets were really just picking up different territory, installing regimes that were really sort of puppet regimes for themselves. And it was as this began that Winston Churchill, who the famous leader for the British in World War II, who was very successful and probably one of the main reasons the British were able to withstand the German onslaught during the war, and by the way was quickly voted out of office as the war came to a close because his domestic policy was very conservative in the minds of many British. But Churchill came as the guest of Harry Truman to Fulton, Missouri in March of 1946, and he gave what becomes known as the Iron Curtain speech. And what he said was, as much as we appreciated working with the Russians during World War II, and our sense was that Uncle Joe Stalin was our friend and helped us to defeat the terrible Nazis, the truth is that if people would wake up, they'd see that an Iron Curtain was spreading across Europe that segregated those with freedom from those who did not have freedom, and that the Soviets were behind it. And this is the beginning of American public opinion beginning to turn dramatically over just really a couple-year period from thinking of the Soviets as our allies and friends to beginning to think of them as a potential enemy. One of the things that then occurred was that as Truman agreed that the Iron Curtain was falling across Eastern Europe and that people were losing their freedom, there was an attempt to try and make sure that communism didn't spread any further into Western Europe. And again, we find a policy that was very successful. It's called the Marshall Plan. Now, Truman was not that popular at home at this point, so that even though he was instrumental in helping to create this plan, he didn't put his own name on it because it probably would have been voted down. But instead he used a very popular general from World War II, the man who had been sort of the Washington-based leader of the American military, George Marshall, who becomes his Secretary of State, and they call it the Marshall Plan. Now, the Marshall Plan, in essence, said this: the Americans would give loans and invest money into Western European countries and European countries in general that had yet to fall under the sphere of the Soviet Union, and help people to do better so that they didn't turn to communism, or communism really couldn't spread into those countries. And so you see the amount of money that was given in aid to Western European countries following World War II to help them rebuild. Now, again, Americans were not dumb, and so what they knew was, as a result of these loans or this aid, these countries would then turn around and buy American goods because their goods were not being produced at that point to any extent because of the destruction that had taken place during the war. So yes, it was an attempt to stop the spread of communism that succeeded. Yes, we did loan money to these nations. And yes, not only did we get paid back eventually, but the money itself was used to buy American products, which helped to drive the American economy forward. So it was a very successful program, and one that seemed to help to stem the tide of too many more areas falling under the sphere of the Soviet Union. The U.S. responded to the Marshall Plan by blockading American and Western access to Berlin. Now, if we go back to our map of Berlin itself, or of Germany following World War II, as it was created under the Yalta Conference. Remember that the eastern portion of Germany was given to the Russians as their zone, and eventually it will become what becomes known as East Germany, which stays communist until the Berlin Wall falls in 1989. The western portion, that was the U.S. zone, the French zone, and the British zone, will become known as West Germany, and it will be have democratic government, in fact, based in Frankfurt. I believe that was where the capital was, and it will be an area, a bastion of freedom. Now, the problem, however, is that the city of Berlin is split up exactly the same way. So once the Cold War begins, you have a Soviet zone, and in the middle of it is this hotbed of capitalism that is West Berlin. And what happened with the response by the Russians to the Marshall Plan was that they cut off land access, either by rail or by road, to Berlin or West Berlin from West Germany or the Western zones. Now the question was, what would the United States do here? And Truman's attempt here was to keep West Berlin open, but he did not want to start an all-out World War III against the Soviet Union, although there were calls in the U.S. to do that. He did not want to do that. And so what he then began was something that took place between 1946 and 1948. And this was using the planes left over from World War II to bring supplies to West Berlin so that the people could stay free and also stay supplied. And it was the 2-year Berlin airlift, which was very popular in Germany and still sort of seen as a very popular part of German history, to supply them until Stalin finally gave up and reopened the land access to Berlin. Now remember, Stalin's point in doing this was trying to just force the Western nations to give up on their little democratic enclave within the middle of a Soviet-controlled East Germany. So this begins the process of new military alliances, which is ratcheted up as far as tension when both sides, the Americans first, of course, and then later as the Soviets, will get the atomic weapon and then move forward to create the hydrogen bomb. Now, the hydrogen bomb is much more powerful than the atomic bomb. In fact, it's so powerful it uses the atomic bomb as its trigger mechanism, and the explosive force and the destruction created by the hydrogen bomb is thousands of times stronger than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So as a result of the Cold War and what began as this threat that the two sides might end up using these terrible weapons against each other, both sides formed alliances. Now this is interesting because we kind of thought that the alliance system had been blamed for World War I, but it reappears now after World War II. And so the Western nations joined together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And you see all the countries here in green were and to an extent still are part of NATO. Now at that point the Soviets responded by bringing all the nations they controlled together under what was called the Warsaw Pact. They made the agreement in Warsaw, Poland, and it was in essence the Communist Alliance. So the two were now facing off. The two now had very powerful weapons, and the explosive nature of the hydrogen bomb and the one, and Soviets will blow theirs up not long after that, 10 months later. And the explosive nature of that was seen, as you see in the picture here in the middle. That's the American test of the first hydrogen bomb. And that took place on islands that were taken from the Japanese in World War II, after World War II, here in the Pacific, in this area. These islands were taken and they were used for atomic testing and later hydrogen testing. And one of the islands that was used, the island that was used for the first hydrogen bomb, was an island called Bikini. And interestingly, a Paris swimsuit designer, and you see him here, quickly after the atomic bomb or the hydrogen bomb was exploded and people saw that the island or atoll of Bikini had been blown away, he designed a swimsuit that many people said looked like had portions of it blown away, called the Bikini, and that's where the term comes from today. That leads us to the 1948 election. Give 'em Hell Harry, as Harry Truman was known, versus Had Enough Dewey. Now, Truman was very unpopular, at least it seemed, and it seemed pretty likely that Dewey would win. In fact, so much so that a couple of the newspapers, before all the votes were counted, predicted or actually published headlines that said Dewey had defeated Truman. But you can see the very close nature of this election. You also see a third party pop up here, and it's in the Deep South, and it's the first true rumblings of the segregationist movement, because one of the things that's coming out of World War II is the beginning of a movement to try and desegregate America as African Americans come back from the war, from a place where they were treated as equal. And as I told you, there are massive social forces that are unleashed by all the changes of World War II. And you can see that in some of the deep southern states, they actually vote for a candidate who says he's for states' rights, but what he's really pushing is the idea of keeping segregation and not allowing change to occur. And so those votes were taken away from Truman because they probably would have voted Democrat, so he didn't get as much as he probably would have. However, Truman is still able to defeat Dewey in the election of 1948, 303 to 189. And this picture on the right is a very famous picture, not just in American history, but in any kind of historical look at the idea of polling and sampling as a way of deciding what people think and what they're going to do. Because from the polls, the experts predicted, and you can see here the headlines published in the Chicago Tribune that said Dewey defeats Truman. And in fact, the opposite was actually true. Now that leads us to China and Korea in the Cold War. The Chinese Civil War, as we talked about earlier, resumed after the Japanese surrender. The communists were led by Mao Zedong, and Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the communist forces that the Americans and Western nations supported, who they believed would be more democratic. Unfortunately for the democratic history of the nation of China, in 1948, Mao and his forces prevailed in the Civil War and created the communist nation of China. Now, in American terms, from the American perception, the question was, how did the United States lose the most populous nation in the world to the evils of communism? And so there was a sense that the U.S. had, quote, lost China, or it fell to China, or fell to communism. And this is something that's blamed on the Democrats because they were in power. And in fact, there's a whole conspiracy theory that grows up around the Yalta Conference that we had talked about earlier. One of the assistants to Roosevelt at Yalta was a man by the name of Alger Hiss, who, as Congress began to search for communists everywhere, culminating in the McCarthy hearings of 1952, there was a sense that this man, Alger Hiss, had actually somehow helped or forced Roosevelt to make deals with the communists that had allowed a lot of Europe to be given away, if you want to use that term, to communism. And one of the Republicans who made his political name in going after this assistant to Roosevelt in Congress in hearings was actually Richard Nixon, who we'll be talking quite a bit about later. But the premise is that the United States lost China and it's America's fault. The truth is that the Chinese communists just outfought the regime that we supported. And in fact, if we go back to our map, the regime that we supported was driven from China itself and ends up here on what is today called Taiwan. And that's actually the people who live there today. They are the losers of the Chinese Civil War, the ones that we had believed would be more democratic. But for our purposes, the most populous nation in the world had now become communist. And the Democrats will then, for many, many years to come, and even today to some extent, if communism was still around, you'd still see this, but the Democrats will suffer from the accusation that they're weak on communism. And this is a label that will remain on them for the rest of the Cold War and has a lot to do with many decisions that we'll see made in foreign policy by future Democratic presidents. And the Republicans will use this particular idea, much like the Republicans had used the bloody shirt after the Civil War. The Republicans will hit the Democrats over the head during the Cold War when there is huge fear of communism, with the idea that because they are more like communists, in other words, that's the argument that they made, because they were more left-leaning, that they were more like communists, that they would be more likely to give up things to the communists, and that they were weak on communism. So that will lead us to the Korean War, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail when we start class on Monday. but you'll see that this is a place where a Democratic President, Truman, said, I cannot allow any more territory to be taken by the communists, partially because of the accusation that Democrats were